Hi, I'm Malcolm Stern, and in conjunction with my friends John and Sandra Wilson from Online Events, we're creating a series of podcasts called Slay Your Dragons with Compassion. My book of the same name was conceived and inspired by the suicide of my daughter Melissa and the journey that took me on and the internal resources that I found. All of my guests will have a story to tell around overcoming and ultimately thriving through adversity. Special thanks to the band Stairway, Jim McCarty and Louis Chinamo, for the use of theme music from their album Medicine Dance, and my engineer Owen Santiago. I hope you enjoy this series, and thanks for listening. Welcome to my podcast, Slay Your Dragons with Compassion, which I'm doing in conjunction with my friends at Online Events, having a range of very interesting guests, and today is no exception whatsoever. And Andrew, you've got a very interesting story. I don't know where the story is going to lead, but I think the main thing is the one is that you're a profound businessman, so you're not a flake, and yet you also run wizard training.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's accurate, but something along those lines.
Yeah.
And perhaps you could tell us a bit about that and what makes you a wizard and what is a wizard training out there.
Well, I created the School for Wizards, which is a brand I love. And we had two trainings every year, about 18 people in each training. And the two pillars of that training is that everyone is already a wizard. So everyone has the capacity for creativity, for magic, for alchemy. And the course is basically about clearing what's in the way, clearing the mental constructs, the emotional, the spiritual baggage that is getting in the way of people living a life as alchemists or as wizards. And so that's very simple, and it's based around a quadrinity of the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual.
Very interesting. And what led you towards wizardry? You didn't presumably wake up one day and
Well,
become a
no, I
wizard.
know. It was actually quite a funny story because I trained as a psychotherapist. I'd done a lot of different trainings in psychology and body work and did some wacky stuff in India. And a journalist once wrote quite a long piece about me for no less than the Daily Mail, actually, which was
Wow.
so. And she phoned me up before she submitted her piece, and she said, "Look, what do I call you? I don't know." She'd been to see me, and she said, "It's like nothing else. I don't know what you do. What do you want me to call you?" And I said, "Well, I don't know what I call myself, and in fact, I don't call myself anything. You're the writer. You decide." So she then wrote this piece and said, "He's like a modern day wizard. He shifts people's energy. He's like a," and
Nice.
at the time, Malcolm, I hated it. I thought, "Oh my God." And then about 6 months later, somebody suggested to me, "Why don't you rebrand as the modern day wizard?" And I thought, well, I like that because I'm not an old fashioned wizard. I like the idea of being being modern day.
Yes.
And it all flowed from there, really.
Because often one would see, or I would see, I won't just to sort of like distance myself, but I would obviously see something that called itself wizardry or something like that as probably quite flaky. You're the last thing I know is
Yeah.
flaky. I mean, you're very grounded. You have
Yeah.
a good career. You're an entrepreneur. You're lots of things, and yet this wizard is quite an interesting sort of parallel path that you're taking.
Well, I think that's a really fair comment, Malcolm. And I think there's two aspects to it. What I discovered is it attracted and alienated people in equal measure. So you're right. I saw a lot of people that said, "Oh, I want to go and see the wizard," and then they shared it with their children, and they turned up at my door and said, "Oh, you're not wearing a peaky hat." And then a lot of their husbands and businessmen thought it was ridiculous, and it sort of slightly alienated them. So it was interesting to see who was attracted to that and who was repelled by it. But I think the other element of it for me is all of my life since I was about 2 years old. I've really been a rebel. I've been a nonconformist. I've always wanted to work out ways of doing it differently. And I got to a place in my life where I felt the outer constructs and the categories. So, for example, I didn't want to be a psychotherapist. I didn't want to be a coach. I didn't want, there was a whole lot of options that put people in boxes. And then you had the whole regulation piece that suddenly regulation became a big piece. And I thought, I don't want to fit into any of those categories. And what I said on my website and what I said to people is when the government starts to regulate wizards, I'll call myself something else.
Yes,
So,
I've often thought that with psychotherapy, I could call myself a mentor, for
yeah.
example. Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think mentor is fine. I think you are a mentor, and I quite like the word elder. I'm now in a particular stage of my life like you, and I do value mentoring and eldering, other people and communities. I think that's in other societies, they do that so much better, you
They
know.
do.
Yeah.
It's true because I often feel that the title psychotherapist sort of shrinks me into a particular box.
Yeah.
And actually, yeah, it's essentially because I'd have to come out with some arrogance, but I don't feel arrogant about it. I
No,
feel
no.
I have some wisdom that I'm able to adapt
Yeah.
to people's scenarios, and it seems to work. And I've got some tools that I work that wisdom with. Now, I'm thinking to myself, am I now a wizard?
You
Um,
are. No, you're definitely a wizard to me. You're one of my top wizards. I think I think
Fantastic.
you're so for me, you definitely are. And it's like everything. All of my work and in the clinical room, I use humor a lot. So for me, people, I don't really like the word spiritual or spirituality, but anyone who thinks they're spiritual or anyone who's on that path, if they haven't got a good sense of humor, I'm suspicious of them, you know?
That's really interesting. I went to a sort of an evening with a quite a well-known spiritual teacher,
Yeah.
and I came away from it going, everything he said was really profound and wise, but it didn't touch me. And I thought the reason it didn't touch me is the humor wasn't there.
Yeah.
And so even when I'm working with quite deep trauma with
Yeah.
people, I will often use humor as a way of actually diverting, not of walking away from it, but of diverting it in order to allow some lightness to come in.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is really important. The use of humor in our work is really
Yeah.
important.
I do that a lot, Malcolm, like you. And there was a moment, but probably 12 years ago, when I was in my course room and there was stuff happening, and we reached that moment where we both sort of dissolved into uncontrollable laughter. And in that moment, what I realized, and I don't mean this completely literally, this is a statement that has some truth that we can explore. But in that moment, I realized that in one sense, it doesn't really matter whether we're raging and hitting a mattress with a baseball bat, whether we're sobbing and there's snot on the end of our nose, or whether we're laughing uncontrollably, because all those things are shifting the energetic field around us. And so for me, humor and laughter is desperately important.
I like that, Andrew. That's sort of that definitely goes along with. I mean, it doesn't mean it's right because you and I both agree, but I do get that sense of without humor, we become very po-faced, or we can easily spiritually bypass. And I've seen a lot of that in my
Yes,
time at Alternatives, is that people would get up on stage and you would see that they're naming great achievements,
yes,
but they don't seem to be embodying it in the same way.
yes. And
And
of
I think
course,
that's
the
important.
other pitfall is that it leads to a form of asceticism or denial. So, in all the great religions and spiritual practices, there are pathways where people take seriousness or asceticism to extremes. And by the way, I definitely have a good ascetic within me. I can go down that pathway. And I spent years experimenting with asceticism and hedonism, and I eventually thought hedonism was probably more fun. But so I think, a mixture and a lightness. The Buddhists have this expression, wear life like a loose garment. And you can't always do that, but actually the extent to which you can have a sort of a laity or brevity about what's going on, however difficult, I find the pathway through it becomes so much easier.
And I think that's really profound as long as we also go to the depths and don't just lift it into the sort of like the sweet and lovely.
No, 100%. So all of my work, there's a beautiful saying by Carl Jung that says, we don't become enlightened by dancing with angels. Become enlightened by going into the darkness type thing. And so all of my work is really shadow work. And I deal with trauma a lot. But again, what I found, and I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth, but in the midst of trauma, when people are reliving very, very difficult situations, sometimes humor just shifts.
Totally agree.
And so you've got to deal with the trauma. And to me, there's only two options with trauma. You either live it and you're bitter for the rest of your life, or you transform it into wisdom. So, when you talk about being wise, wisdom comes from transformed trauma for me. That's, you know.
Okay, that's lovely. That sort of leads me into where we're heading now
Oh,
as
okay.
well.
I
Because
like to oblige.
you do a very good segue job here, Andrew. So the podcast was inspired by the suicide of my daughter 10 years ago.
Yes.
And I wrote a book called Slay Your Dragons with Compassion, and I now run the podcast called Slay Your Dragons with Compassion. And what I learned in the process was that by going into and allowing the trauma to mold me and shape me, I became a bigger person. I didn't go, oh, hello, God, I'd like to sort of go through a real trauma and tragedy so that
Yeah.
I can grow. But somehow it happened despite me.
Yes.
And I'm wondering whether you've had, I'm just thinking about personalizing it because I love your philosophy and I think
Yeah.
you are definitely a wise man, Andrew. And I'm not bashing you, but I've always found that in knowing you. And but I'm just wondering how your own personal trauma challenge has shaped you and what's led you to where you are.
So, if I may, I'll tell you two brief stories. One's a bit longer than another.
Long, they can be long. It's all right. We've
But
got time.
I once had this therapist who flew over from Germany to see me, and I do 3 hour sessions. So I do a session in the morning, a session in the afternoon. And I did this 3 hour session, and it happened to be particularly crazy or wackier than most. We did breathing, we did psychodrama, we did all sorts of different role play, etc. And as he was leaving, he said, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Where did you learn to do all that stuff?" And I paused and I said, 30 years of pain.
Nice.
And that was it. Again, I didn't know what I was going to say. That's what came out. And the beginning of all this, Malcolm, when you asked me, why was I wizard or etc., I could have gone back to 1984, which obviously is just over 40 years ago. So I had a very successful business career and I was making a lot of money and I was flying around the world first class and I was drinking very heavily and I was taking drugs, but it was more alcohol than drugs. It's a very well-trodden pathway. And I got to the point where I couldn't carry on, so I gave it all up. And I had 3 weeks of euphoria, and then I became clinically depressed. And I was quite paranoid, very anxious. I was seeing a psychiatrist, and I literally ran away to America. And my world was getting smaller and smaller, and I was madder and madder. And I was staying in a little flat at the top of this building, a tiny little room. And I was having a particularly bad time. And I was definitely suicidal. And I always felt, and I don't want to offend you in any way, but I felt for me
Right.
that my suicide was quite rational because I remember lying on a psychiatrist's couch and saying, if I'm going to live like this for the next 20 years, I don't want to be here. And that felt like an incredibly rational thought. So I was in that place where I didn't want to live, didn't want to die. And I have no idea why I did this. I mean, in one sense I do, but I went into this bedroom. I knelt down by the side of the bed in a very sort of childlike prayer. And I said the most honest prayer that I've ever said in my life before or since. And I said, if there's a God, for fuck's sake, do something now. That's what I said. That was my prayer.
Great.
And it came from every sinew in my body. And like other people have written, there's a great book by William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. I'm sure you've read it, but instantly I felt this peace that I'd never experienced before, and I felt the presence of God. Now, I wouldn't want to give a lecture or even talk for 2 minutes about what the presence of God means, but that's all I can say. That's what I felt. And I don't know whether I was on my knees by that bed for 2 minutes or 2 hours. I still don't know. But that experience is as vivid to me now as it was then. And it changed everything. So a psychologist might say it was a collapse of the ego boundaries and something shifted in the egoic field. And that's fine. But for me, it changed the direction of my life profoundly.
What I'm hearing actually in this, Andrew, it's quite interesting because I'm a psychologist, so I could easily go,
Yeah.
yes, that's absolutely accurate.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I could say to that is that I actually believe that your prayer was, this is from my perspective,
Yes.
and I believe that your prayer was actually transmitted. You actually reached the point where you genuinely had hit rock bottom,
Yeah.
that you genuinely meant, please
Please.
show me yourself
I'm
I
off.
can't take it anymore.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I think there is something about going to the edge that
Yes.
moves there. So I had a heart attack about 3 years ago.
Okay.
And I'm in the ambulance thinking I'm going to die. So
Yeah.
I'm sitting in the ambulance and it's like I'm in quite a lot of pain and discomfort. And suddenly I came to the place where I might die.
Yeah.
And there was suddenly some peace came over me
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
some bliss came over me. It sounds very similar to what you've just
Yes.
described. It was okay. It
Yeah.
really was okay. And I thought this is so weird, but I went with it
Yeah.
and
Isn't
let
that
it take me where it
beautiful?
took me.
Because the thing is, Malcolm, as you and I both know, we're all going to die. You're going to die. I'm going to die. We're all going to die. And actually, I genuinely, intellectually, and I think also existentially, I have no fear of death. I think when we die, it's going to get exciting. I think all sorts of things are going to happen. And
Yeah.
Osho, who a lot of people will know, but Osho once said death, the ultimate orgasm. And I ran a workshop in Sussex. I ran 2 or 3 workshops, 2-day workshops on death, the ultimate orgasm. And on the first one, my 84-year-old mother turned up with her best friend.
Wow.
It was quite an experience. But actually, once we really confront death, which we sort of wrongly present as finality, really we're at peace because there's nothing. What else are people going to throw at us?
It's very true, but it's quite a journey to get to that place
It
where
is.
it's genuine. And I think that's the key. I
Yeah.
know that you're genuine. I know that you do not
Yeah.
bullshit.
No.
It's interesting because I said to you at the beginning, if there's anything you want to edit out, let me know. And you said, no, don't
Yeah.
worry. And I genuinely get it. You're
Yeah.
speaking your truth.
Yeah.
And unless we get into a fisticuffs, which we won't be able to do online
Yeah.
anyway,
Uh-huh.
you're going to, it's going to bring the dialogue is going to create an exploration that we're both on. What I love about these podcasts is that
Yeah.
we
It's
get
brilliant.
into a joint exploration.
Yes.
So actually, you're bringing up a really important subject here because death is the ultimate thing that people fear.
Yeah.
And I've interviewed some people who are dying on this podcast to see what their process is. And I
Mm.
worked with this guy who was in one of my ongoing groups who was dying. And he wanted to meet each person in the group and look them in the eyes and talk to them about what dying felt like.
Mm.
And we received him, and it was one of the most beautiful sessions. It
Yeah.
could have been, oh my God, this guy's dying, what can we do? But no one felt like they needed to fix him. No one felt like there was going to be some magic formula, he was going to
Yeah.
get better. And he did eventually die, but he got fully met by our group. And so I love what you're saying about death, the ultimate orgasm.
Yeah.
It is, we are on a journey. We're on a journey through eternity, obviously, unless we are blind to that as well.
Yeah.
And what can we do with this one wild and
Yeah.
precious life?
Well, we're already on that journey, aren't we? Because the eternity stretches backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
So basically, we are spirit, we are eternal. And this experience in our body, even as beautiful as your body is, Malcolm, and my body is even more beautiful.
Mine's got a bit fat these days, but yes.
Me too. But it's still just a sort of it's a short period of time. And like you, I share two things with you. On Wizard School, we had two people dying in completely different trainings. And that opened up the group and opened up the individuals in the group in a way nothing else could. So to me, there was a magic in that that was unbelievably profound. And I've forgotten what the other thing is I was going to say. It's gone.
But that's a good one anyway. And I
Yeah,
just like to reflect on that. We had something very interesting happened in my last two 1 year groups.
yeah,
So my current 1 year group, one of the guys in the group died, not in the group, but during the
yeah,
course of the group. But he'd reached the point in his life where he'd retired, he was drinking, he didn't have much going for him. I'm not making that right or wrong. I'm just saying
no,
that was the way it was. And the group were upset. We
no.
miss having him in our midst. But the year before, I had this beautiful man called Matthew Pruen who's actually done one of these podcasts with me. And he was a Hoffman trainer. You probably know the Hoffman
Yes,
program.
I've done the Hoffman.
Oh, right. So he was a Hoffman trainer and a profound man and a Palestinian. And he helped put across the Palestinian cause in a
Yeah,
way that really educated the group. And his life was so full and rich. And he got pancreatitis, died quite, with 3 months in intensive care and died. And the distress in that group at the loss of this beautiful soul was enormous. And I think there's something about living our purpose that makes it, let's really give it our all. Because once we
yeah, yeah,
decide to
yeah.
wind down, people often say to me, are you going to retire? Well, I have no concept of
No,
retire. What will I do?
no,
I
no.
go for walks and shopping.
Yeah. So I've remembered my other story, which
Yes.
is again is a wonderful segue to what you just shared, Malcolm. So I had this client that came to see me once, and I can't remember his name. And I sat with him for 2 hours. We even had a slightly shorter session, and I've never seen him again. And he was dying. He had cancer. And he was a beautiful soul, like the man you talked about. And he walked in and he said, "The reason I'm here is," he said, "I've got a dilemma that I can't resolve." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I was given this terminal diagnosis 4 months ago. And over the last 4 months," he said, "I discovered a depth of love within me for my wife and for my children that I didn't know was possible."
Beautiful.
Yeah. And
Beautiful.
he described the relationship with his wife, with his children, and with his friends. And he said, "I didn't know that anyone could experience this." And I said, "What's the dilemma?" And he said, "If I had to choose again, would I choose to die and go, to
Great
leave them
question.
before, and or whatever?" And it's so beautiful. And in the end, I suggested to him, I said, "Why do you need to resolve the dilemma? It's a dilemma. It's like there might not be an answer,
Yeah.
um, but you can't change reality." So, but he was so grateful for the experience that his terminal cancer had given him, because without that, he wouldn't have known, he would not have had that experience.
Which is, you've just raised a really important, larger point in that as well, Andrew. So and that is that often when we hit the trauma where we can't escape from that trauma,
Yeah.
like a death diagnosis or someone you love dying,
Yes.
it takes us into, it seems to me, an altered state of consciousness where
Yes.
we actually become who we truly are. We
Yes.
get stripped naked. And I
Yes.
think that's absolutely fascinating that we are in a time in the world, on the largest world stage,
Yes.
a great deal of trauma and difficulty.
Yes.
We can go, oh my God, this is such a terrible world. I don't want to be in it. Or how can I really live fully despite the pain and the struggle?
Well, it's almost aligned with the pain and the struggle, not despite, because for me, I think you're right. We've created all these cultures and these societies where we get hung up on, or we're in conditioned into, that we're here to be happy, or we're here to be joyful, or and I don't know where these ideas come from, but they're very strong and very prevalent. And the cultures we've created, I call them, collective hypnosis. People are wandering around, they're not really living. And so for me, in a generic way, that one of the reasons that we're here is to evolve, is to awake. I like the term, we need to wake up. I need to wake up. I'm a work in progress. And so for me, the greatest catalyst for waking up is crisis. That's what we've been talking from the moment we got together today. And so all this trauma in the world and the mess in the world, Joseph Campbell once said, the world's a mess. It's a perfect mess. And it is a perfect mess. It's supporting our collective evolution. It's supporting our collective awakening. And, I had an experience on Monday of this week where I had a very nasty fall, 7 o'clock in the morning, pitch black in the woods with the dogs. I'd gone out too early and I had excruciating pain and I was lying with my head in a muddy puddle. And
Yeah, we didn't get a picture actually, Andrew, but anyway, carry on.
Okay. And that experience has enriched me immensely in the last 4 or 5 days. And there'll still be things that I'll be learning from it in the weeks and months to come. So whatever whatever experience you have, and I could never speak for the people in Ukraine who are watching their mothers raped or children's raped. I'm not, it's not my job. They will have to speak for themselves when the time comes. But in my life, I've had trauma, I've had, crises, et cetera, et cetera. And what I know to be true is that over time, and in many times it's taken me 20 years because I'm defiant and I'm resistant but over time I'm learning to transform each one of those traumas and wounds to wisdom.
Lovely. I think that's actually a really, really succinct statement of our evolutionary process. And it can lift the spirits of us and the people who are watching this as well.
Yeah.
That actually we can go, oh my God, why am I being punished by God or
I know.
by life?
I know.
Rather than what is it? And the early Christian mystics used to say more suffering. They used to beg God for
Yeah.
more suffering because
Yeah.
they knew it would wake them up.
Yeah.
And I can see that, my suffering, if I look at it, for a long time, I had a pretty bland, not bland, but it's like quite an exciting life, but
Yeah.
not full of suffering. And I felt like I was sort of puttering along quite happily.
Yeah.
Then you get the big trauma that comes, and you go, either I'm going to rise to this and
Yes.
allow that, I didn't do this consciously, allow this to transform me, or
Mm.
I'm going to be swamped by it.
Yeah.
And I think that somehow those resources seem to come for me when that happened. And what I'm hearing is that your journey has led you through similar spaces where actually you are now embracing what happens to you and
Yes.
not fighting with the process.
Yeah, and I don't want to be picky with you, Malcolm, but
Now,
one of the
be picky,
no,
be
no, no.
picky.
But
It's all right. Yeah.
one of the things I thought as when I logged on and I had a few moments, I thought I think for me in my experience, I've shifted from slaying the dragon to befriending the dragon. I think we have to befriend our demons. We have to befriend, when I was a 7, 8 year old boy, I was beaten until my bottom bled, and it was a very traumatic experience, and it stayed with me for 20, 30 years. But I can honestly say, if I think about it too much, I begin to tense in my body. I can feel it's there, but
Yes.
but it doesn't really impact my life in any single way, shape, or form. And so I've befriended that experience, and I no longer, whoever was doing the beating or the raping or whatever, I no longer blame them because they were fulfilling their role that was assigned for me to have that experience, so to speak. And I don't do that lightly. Like I've been into the trauma of it. I spent years sobbing and complaining and ranting about it. But eventually, I think we need to befriend our demons because we all have them, and the dragons, and the nine-headed monsters, and whatever else is there. And once we do that, we're at peace. And then, in my experience, we're at peace for a while, and then the next one comes comes alive.
Exactly. Exactly. We
You
don't
know,
we
it's
don't
like,
get an easy ride.
no, no.
But I think we weren't designed to get an, and if we look at the design of humanity, we
Yeah.
weren't designed to have a lovely time. I mean, there's that great H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, where it goes forward 80,000 years into the future, and the people
Yes.
there are all dressed in white and playing harps, but there's
Yes.
no challenge anymore. And
No.
I think it's the challenge that keeps me alert and alive. And I'm hearing very much that you have actually you've wrestled with your
I
dragons.
definitely have.
You've learned to befriend them, and I actually think slaying is step for me. Slaying is step one. Take
Yes.
Face whatever it is you've got to face, and really uproot
Yeah.
it. But then come to a place where we go, or as Ramdas, who I studied with quite a lot, used to say, "Arso." Come to a place where you go, "Arso, this is the way it
Yes.
is. I'm not fighting with it anymore."
Yeah.
But I think that's a step on. So I don't think you're. I think it's great to be
No, I
told.
agree with you. I think they're
Yeah.
two different chapters.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And I think I was talking to a young man yesterday who's a client on the telephone. He's 24 or something. And, he was complaining that he was struggling and struggling with something and it wasn't changing. And I was saying that it seems to me that life, that every species, not just the human species, every species and even every plant species evolves through struggle. This sort of resonates with what Darwin said all that time ago. But the way we evolve, the way we develop resilience, the way we develop wisdom is through the struggle. And
Yeah.
if you take the struggle away, you have weak plants, weak trees, weak animals, and nothing evolves. So I think resetting and reframing the way we look at trauma and struggle and all of these things is really important because otherwise we feel a victim. Why has this happened to me?
Yeah. And I think that's certainly where I'm coming to in myself as well. That
Yeah.
originally, when Melissa died, my daughter died,
Yeah.
I felt like there was a bastard God up there. It's like
Yeah.
I was raging against
Yeah.
against life. But bit by bit, it educated me. And the thing is, I think we can't rush the education process. The
No,
struggle has to be gone through. We've got to go all the way
you
in
have.
through, and
There's no
that's hard.
shortcuts. And,
There's
and
no
the
shortcuts.
unfortunate thing is we live at a time when we've developed culture to such an extent that everyone wants it now. And
Yes.
I'm as guilty as the next person. I sit at my computer at 10 o'clock at night. I order something from Amazon. It arrives on my doorstep the next morning. It's like now.
Yes.
And one of my favorite stories, which comes from your cultural tradition, the Jewish Judeo-Christian tradition, is I love the story where we start out in the Garden of Eden. We start out in paradise, which is really oneness. We start out in oneness. And we walk around naked because there's nothing to hide and it's all lovely. And then there's a decisive moment when we're separated from ourselves. We're cast out of a state of oneness and we create separation for the first time. And the first thing we do in the story is we blame God. We say God expelled us from the state of oneness, just like you did with your, the bastard God created this separation. When in fact, the only person that can ever create separation is me. We step out of oneness to separation. And then, in a way, I think all of our lives and evolution is getting back to that state of oneness. So I think the experience that you described in the ambulance going to the hospital when you thought I'm going to die, you just suddenly you're in oneness with everything because there's nothing, and
Yes.
the experience I have when I'm kneeling by the side of the bed. Now, I would say in my life, it's difficult to talk about, but I would say every week or every month, I have little moments of oneness, of touching oneness. And they're not always in meditation or something. Sometimes they're sitting at the kitchen table with a hot cup of tea, feeling completely sated. And then the moment you have the experience, it's gone again.
Yes.
But I think evolution is really getting back to where we started, which is this sense of oneness. Because when we're there, I see that hurting you is hurting me, or it's like there's no point in any separation. So I've read books about it, and there's great books about it, but the books mean nothing without the experience.
I think that's the thing. We can be philosophers and sort of
Yeah,
stand back from the experience,
yeah,
or we can actually throw ourselves onto the stage and
yes,
allow the experience to basically break us open.
yes,
And Michael Meade says that in order to become who we truly are, not only does the heart have to be broken, it has to be broken many times because
Yes.
the only heart worth having is a broken heart that we learn how to heal.
I completely agree. And there's a woman whose name I've forgotten, but there's a paragraph she wrote about multiple heartbreaks, and eventually it breaks wide open.
Yeah.
But until you go, and if you're not willing to go through that, then you'll never get there. It's the only way out is through. And it's difficult to go into the trauma, as you know, Malcolm. And you think after you've been doing it, I've been doing this stuff for 40 years, as you have pretty much, and you'd think it gets easier, but it doesn't. I always say to people that the next thing for me to work on, I must have hidden incredibly well, or I would have got to it before now. So actually, the resistance is still the same. The temptation to blame others is still the same, but we learn some tools along the way, as you talked about.
And I think there's also a temptation to allow ourselves to follow addictive paths to
Exactly.
escape from it. And it
Yeah.
can be quite subtle. It doesn't have to be getting mindlessly drunk or
Yeah.
stoned out
Yeah.
of the brains. It can be eating sugar that actually takes you
Yeah.
away from your feelings. It can
Yes.
be blobbing out on television or
Yes.
Netflix or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm feeling inspired by today's talk is that actually this dialogue, because I feel that this dialogue is beautiful. I'm really enjoying engaging with you, Andrew.
Yeah.
So
Me
it's really
too.
lovely. And I think what I'm coming away from this, because we're coming towards the end of our time, but what I'm coming away from this dialogue with is a renewed reminder that actually I am on an endless journey through eternity, and that waking up is the only thing worth having,
It is.
and everything else could be a distraction. But
Yeah.
I don't want to distract myself. I want
Yeah.
to embed myself in the journey of evolution.
Yeah.
So I always ask my guests this at the end of the podcast, which is, and I know we've talked about the slay and the tame, or the slay and the befriend, but I ask which dragon have you had to slay? What hurdles have you had to overcome in order to be who you are today?
Wow. Well, there are too many, really. The ones that come to mind are, judgment. It's so full of judgment. And that's a good example of just befriend my judgment. I'm never going to live a life without judgment. Envy is another big one. Egoic, I catch myself thinking, I'm actually quite good, the ego,
No.
you know, and so it goes on. And I think if I had to pick two, and I think these are underrated in people's psyche or the work that they do. I think one of the most damaging and dangerous ones that I've discovered in myself that is very prevalent is the desire to be special, is specialness. And I used to have some, I don't know if you remember Emma Cannon. She died recently. She
Yeah.
was just a beautiful soul. And she was in my wizard school, and I called her out on specialness, and ever since for years she and I used to laugh about specialness, that we want to be special. And someone once said that the only thing that God cannot do for us is to say that we're special. You're not more special than me. I'm not more special than you. And so specialness comes up in all sorts of forms. And the other thing, which I was going to say, which is the same, is the other side of the same coin, is I've noticed in me time and time again, and it's a cycle that comes round. It is that part of me that wants to be worse and badder than anyone else. It is, I no no no, I'm really, the
You're
worst.
vile, Andrew.
You're
Yeah.
vile, Uriah Heep,
Yes.
you're a saint compared to me, Malcolm. So I think that's another form of specialness, and I encounter this in myself and particularly in addicts. In, I've worked with a lot of heroin addicts, a lot of cocaine. They deep down they have this thing, and I just say, "Oh, you want to be special?" And they're sort of writhing. No, no, no. They said we're in agony. I said, "No, no, you're just trying to be special," you know.
I think it's really lovely, and sort of that's what I would call slaying your dragon when you come to the place where
Yes,
you actually you go for them in that way.
yes,
So I really want to. I'm really grateful that you've come on, and it's really lovely to re-engage after many years,
Yeah,
actually,
I haven't seen you for ages.
for ages. But we were in a peer group together at one time where
We
we were
were.
exploring wisdom. It was called the Wisdom Group,
Yes.
and I really felt like I watched you sort of like sort of unerringly go to the jugular of people who are in the group, challenging in a
Yeah.
very profound way. But there's also I think you do slay your dragons, or in your case, befriend your dragons
Yeah.
with compassion. I do see that
Yeah.
compassion is there,
Yeah.
but you won't let things slip so that you have an easier life. I think
No.
that's the way it is. Just want to ask you, have you written any books?
I just finished a book actually, but I don't think it's going to come out for sort of 9 or 12 months. I basically, because I get into alchemy a lot and I started working with businesses, and I developed this program for transformation for businesses because I got to this point where I thought that actually you're not going to change the world by changing individuals. If you're going to change the world, you've got to work with business. And I worked very intensely with this one company that we transformed culturally in a very special way. And then, of course, phenomenally, all the financials just went through the roof. So I've written a book about how we did that, which is more of a business book, actually. And then before that, I wrote my book on intention. So that's a short read, and I think I've had good feedback from that.
Mm. Well, I think you've genuinely got something very real to say, and I think you're in arenas where many of the people who are exploring personal development are not in, and I think there is an opportunity for you in business to
Yes.
make a real difference in the world. I remember one of my early therapists. I'm going to come to the end of the minute. I could chat
Yeah,
to you for
yeah.
hours, but I remember one of my early therapists said to me, I used to see, money's evil. All I was in a very sort of like, sort of white clothes and all this sort of stuff. He said, if you had money, he said, because you care about the environment. He said, if you don't have money, you can sign a petition about the rainforests. He said, if you become a very wealthy man, you can actually buy the rainforests. And I
Yeah,
just thought it stayed with me that my thinking was skewed.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and what I'm hearing is that you're in environments where you have the possibility of altering the state of mind
Mm.
of people who truly can make a difference.
Yeah, immense possibilities. And,
Yes.
and and one of the things that I practice all the time is I talk about this field of infinite possibility. So every morning, sitting in silence, sitting in stillness, not for long periods of time, but tapping into that field of infinite possibility, because that's what we've been talking about, Malcolm. And in every given moment, anything is possible.
Yeah, that's lovely. And that's a lovely place to finish. So thank you so much for coming on. It's been
Thank you.
terrific catching up with you again,
All
and we'll
right.
be in touch.
Wonderful to see you, mate. You're looking younger than ever, if I may say so.
I'm reversing the aging process. I've become Benjamin Button in the end. So
Yeah. All right. Bless
thank
you.
you,
Thank you.
Andrew. We'll be in touch.
All
Cheers.
right. Bye
And I'll
bye.
let you have this soon.